This video will guide you through the square pose. You will learn all about why you'd want to do the square pose, its physiological and energetic benefits, and how to do the pose. You'll be shown some alternatives and options, and we'll learn about contraindications for the pose. These are warnings for people who may have difficulties with certain aspects of the square pose. You'll also be shown how to get into and come out of the pose, and what to do after you finish the posture. Once you know how and why you'd want to do the square pose, visit the square pose performed to be guided through the pose. You can find links to this video and more information about Yin Yoga at yinyoga.com. The square pose is a lovely preparation for the lotus pose, Padmasana. It's a deep opening of the hips through strong external rotation. And if you choose the option where you flex the spine and fold forward, you can also get a lovely decompression of the lower back. For some people, the square pose might not be a good idea because it is a strong external rotation of the hips. If the hips are really tight, the stress usually goes into the next joint, which will be the knee. The knee's fine, and you go into the ankles. So do pay attention to how your knees feel here. If you do feel any pain or tweaking inside the inner knees, use blocks or bolsters as some support underneath the thighs. This will take the pressure off the knees and allow you to stay so you can really marinate in the pose for quite a while. If the ankles feel a little bit of problem, make sure you have a blanket or a towel folded up underneath the ankle, just so you have no pain there. As always, when we're doing a seated forward fold, for people with sciatica, this can exacerbate the symptoms. So make sure you're sitting up on a cushion, something that allows you to tilt the hips forward a little bit more. And for people with lower back disorders, where flexion of the spine is not a good idea, you may wish to skip the part of folding forward. Or if you are going to come forward with a straight spine as opposed to rounding the back. Getting into the square pose can be quite simple if you begin with a cross-legged sitting position. So just sit up on a cushion. Again, make sure your hips are a little bit higher than the knees. Then simply allow your legs to start to come forward until your shins are parallel to the front edge of your mat. Now everybody has different range of motions in their hips. For some people, this may be it. Their knees may be way up in the air, the legs are parallel to the front of the mat, but the knees aren't too low. And that's fine. This may be your first edge, your first version. If you're more flexible, the idea then is to start to get the knees a little bit closer together while keeping the shins parallel to the front edge of the mat. So we keep this square alignment between the thighs and the shins, and you're also parallel to the front edge of the mat. The more flexible students will bring the knees closer and closer in. Eventually, this pose looks like shoelace pose. We have the knees on top of each other, and the shins are parallel to the front edge of the mat. So it's interesting that in its ultimate expression, the square pose is the shoelace pose. In its ultimate expression, the two poses meet. But for most people, they're not going to be able to get to that depth. So again, just line up your shins, and then you can either stay up tall, and this will just let the hips marinate here, or if you're not feeling anything in the hips, you can start to come forward. The thing to watch for as you come into the pose is if your knees are fall apart, you come forward, your feet start to go back again, and you become just in a sitting cross-legged position. And that may be okay. For some people, this is their version of the square pose. As they come forward, they're feeling a lot of this in the hips. But if you don't feel anything here, just check if your feet have slid back inward. So try to keep the shins parallel to the front edge of the mat. And as long as you have that, and as long as you have sensations in the hips, you're doing the pose. Now, alternatives and options for the pose. Again, as the body opens up, you can start to work the knees a little bit closer together. Again, making sure there's no pain in the knee. Any pain in the knee, it's okay to support the thighs. An option is to simply stay sitting up straight. This will still allow the hips to open. And from here, you can add some upper body options. You can add twists here. You can do a few side bends. Or you can do all the upper body options that we've talked about before, eagle arms or cow face arms. So you're letting the hips just marinate here while you do some upper body work. Some people find they don't get much juice just sitting up straight, so now they start to come forward. And as they start coming forward, they feel that lovely tugging now through the outside of the hips. Here you've got lots of options for the head. You can rest the head into the hands, rest the elbows onto the thighs. As you open up, the elbows can come a bit lower. Eventually you might have your elbows onto a block. Remember, there's different height settings for the block. You can start with the high setting at first, which may make this more accessible, and then go to the medium setting, and then to the low setting. And eventually you might not need the block at all. Your elbows will come right to the floor. The other option is simply let the head hang down, so you get the lovely stress to the back of the neck. And even here you can add some of the arm options, such as eagle arms. Just bring your elbows to the floor and hanging out here. This one gets pretty juicy though, so pay attention to what it feels like. The idea is not to hide from the sensations, nor to try to minimize them, but if they're too much, be wise enough to back off or even come out of the pose. The deepest option for those that are very flexible is to come into what's sometimes called the fire log position, where you bring one foot on top of the opposite knee, and then the legs are completely lined up on top of each other. Again, you have to be very externally rotated in your hips to be able to do that. And a lot of people trying to get to that aesthetic look of these very flexible people really start to damage the knees. So don't go there if there's any pain at all. Again, this is not about what it looks like, it's about what it feels like. So if you're feeling it, then you're doing it. If this pose just isn't available to you at all, you can come into any of the other hip opening options, shoelace, winged dragon, swan, or the sitting swan versions, where you simply rest a foot onto a knee and bring the foot in. So if your intention is to work into the hips and this bothers your knee, to do the square pose, find a different pose. Coming out of the square pose is very simple. Just lean back in your hands, roll the top of the hips away first, and then release the legs. If your knees feel tweaked at all, have the legs straight and just bounce out the knees. But because this was a fairly deep external rotation of the hips, we want to internally rotate the hips for a moment, so the windshield wipers work well here. Just drop the knees from side to side. If flexion of the spine made your back feel a little bit tweaked, you can try extension of the spine through the tabletop, just lifting the hips up and down a few times. As always, the more flexible students can do it in the slide with the legs straight, lifting the hips up and down. As we marinate in the square pose, wherever you feel the tugging, you're getting the benefits. So predominantly, as an external hip rotator, a lot of people feel this to the outside of the hips, along the outside of the thighs, and this is the gallbladder meridian. So if you're feeling it through here, you're getting a lot of juice to the gallbladder. And remember, the gallbladder has a yin-yang relationship with the liver. So what you do to one, you do to the other, so this can also enhance qi flow to the liver. If you feel it through the inner groins, you're also working the kidneys and the liver meridians. And as you round forward, if you feel the stress along the back, along the spine, you're adding the urinary bladder meridians here. Obviously, we're working the joint of the hip socket and, to a degree, flexion of the spine. Now, in its easier manifestation, this pose is quite accessible. You can stay here for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. If you're in the really juicy, deep one, and you're not so externally rotated, staying here for 5 minutes could be your limit. But more flexible students who are naturally externally rotated, you can stay here for 5 or 10 minutes if that feels appropriate for you. It's not very yang-like. The muscles can really relax, and that allows us the chance to hang out here for time. In the yang world, this pose is often used as well. It has different names. Some people call it the double pigeon. As mentioned, some people call it the fire logs, or 90-90, or boxcar. The idea, again, in the yin world is to soften into it and let it soak in for time. So we're not muscular engaging here. We're not lengthening the spine. We're allowing the back to round, let the head come down. And the target area mostly is the hips, so we just let this soak in the hip area.